Hello, everyone. This is Shang from China Institute. Welcome to today's session 2 of the Art, Ritual, and Religion series. Let's just wait maybe just 30 seconds to 1 minute, as I can see people are still coming in. And thanks for returning or joining us for this series for the first time. Even though it's the second session, we have the first session recording. And it's still accessible until October 26th. It's a private link. If you haven't received it yet, we will follow up with the link until October 26th. It can be shared only with our registered audience. And during the session, feel free to turn on your camera. I would request that, well, if you could please turn off your mic or your speaker, because well, we have quite a group of audience here today. Just want to make sure, especially during Professor Giuliano's lecture, we all have an uninterrupted experience. All right. Yeah, I can still see we have people coming in.
Just gonna get it clean.
And yeah, I know some of you have joined us from last session. How's everyone? Hello, Christine. And hello, Ranxi. Is that right? Did I say your name correctly? Thank you. And I can see our teacher Sharon, Jiang Laoshi, thank you. And some of our members and students, Carrie, good to see you again. Yeah, so I will start. It's 2 minutes after 7 o'clock. And my name is Shenzhen Liao. I'm the Senior Vice President of Education at China Institute, also head of the School of Chinese Studies at China Institute. Thanks for returning to our sessions and for new participants for joining this session on art, ritual, and religion. It's a 6-session professional development series and also open for the general public. After an insightful introduction reminding us the connection between art, ritual, and religion across time, as we looked at archaeological sites dated back to 14,000 years ago, and space from Europe to Central Asia to China, today's session will really start a journey specifically focusing on China. Just a few reminders before I turn the screen to Professor Annette Giuliano. This session, as you may notice, will be recorded. The link will be shared when ready for only the registered audience for review or to access, as some may have missed the live streaming. Our session 1 video is still available until October 26th. If you've missed the first session, please let us know. As session 1, we will reserve the last 30 minutes to discuss how the content can be connected for K-12 classroom teaching, as this series is designed for professional development purposes. I'm also very glad more teachers joining this session too, even maybe some from China. Many thanks to our educational partners, NYU DCLT, Urban, Chinese Language Teacher Association in Greater New York and New England, as well as Taoties. Everyone in this audience, of course, is welcomed to stay for that last 30 minutes and join the discussion though. Just a reminder for teachers who want to have either CTLE credits or a professional certificate from China Institute, please be sure to fill out the Google form that will be shared at the end of the discussion session. For teacher's session as well as for everyone, I'd like to propose 5 questions while you will soon enjoy Professor Giuliano's richly illustrated lecture. It's not a spoiler, but I was looking at Professor Giuliano's PowerPoint this afternoon. I was so excited, and I'm sure while you are, everyone is in for a real treat. So before that, the 5 questions I will ask my colleague Lin Laoshi to post in the chat box. The first question is, what are the new concepts or keywords you've learned today or have clarified or expanded your understanding of? Question 2, what is your thought of the concept of ritual as is related to your life today and how it can be related to your students? 3, what topics or concepts related to today's lecture can you bring to your students for discussion? 4, what teaching activities do you think you can do with your students? And last but not least, does this lecture remind you of any other topics or resources you want to share or bring up? And also the chat box is a channel that if you have any questions during the lecture, please feel free to post your questions in either English or Chinese. Last but not least, I once again want to thank Professor Giuliano to share your expertise with us and put together this wonderful series. I know the audience will benefit tremendously from you as an art historian on early China and the Silk Road, and for K-12 teachers, your example as an educator for students, researchers, and the general public from New York University, as well as from China Institute. So Professor Giuliano, looking forward to your lecture. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. And can we start with the first slide? The thing about the notice about being recorded won't leave. I got it. Okay. Now, today, this is the second in the series about art, ritual, and religion. And I wanted to just, you will be able to look at the slides and, as I said, the record, as she said, as Shenzhen explained, the recording up until the 26th of October, so that you can get an idea if you didn't see the first lecture. I just wanted to reiterate the discussion was to focus on the fact that as human beings, we all address the questions of how we live and how we die, and art, ritual, and religion is an expression of this. Art being a way of expressing the ideas of religion and the importance of ritual that is the process of expressing these ideas. And we talked about sacred space in many different forms, which is an important part of it. Sacred space from outside in the natural world to inside to buildings created by people to create an experience that reinforces the importance of the ideas and of the rituals. So that was the first way of discussing this. And then today we will start probing more of the use of art, ritual, the art in ritual and religion in China, specifically in ancient China, starting with the Shang Dynasty. Have the next, please. And the Shang Dynasty is one of the early dynasties in China's ancient history, and it runs from about 1600 BCE to 1050 BCE. And of course, before that, there was a long period of Neolithic cultures, which we're not addressing today. in this part of this in the series. But the first thing I wanted to talk about uh, is the mystery of the Shang first in terms of how it was discovered, because this is a very interesting part of how people form ideas and think about what they see on objects. And I listed here Taoties, which are what you see on the screen, this mask-like creature with two large eyes, and then the dragons and ancestors who play a significant role in this the ritual and religion. Could I have the next, please? Now, when I say unraveling the mystery of the Shang Dynasty, here we have what are called Shang ritual bronzes. And they are these containers. They can be small, they can be large, and they have different shapes, which we'll talk about because that reflected different functions. And these rubbings, the one on the left with the square ding is, and there's a one on the right for the rounded body ding, that this these different vessels were known in the world in the 19th century and the 20th century, and China in the early 20th century, and they were dug up, but no one actually understood how old they were and what they were connected to. And they knew they were ancient Chinese, but and in China they knew they were ancient Chinese, and the technique of casting of these bronze vessels was so sophisticated, many people felt that since this was, they were finding these vessels that were so sophisticated, they were digging them up in the grounds, and especially in northern China and around the Luoyang, Anyang, Xi'an area in the north, that that probably the Western scholars thought it was the casting techniques were being introduced from the West, who had already, because they had a long history of casting, but they remained somewhat mysterious in terms of understanding what they were used for, what the culture was. This mask that you see on the center one, the rounded body ding, as they call it, the tripod ding, with the eyes, you can always spot the two eyes, which are part of the taotie that dominates the iconography or decor of bronzes during this period. They in the Song Dynasty in the 12th century, there were many people interested in collecting these bronzes that they found. That's how long ago they would come upon these vessels that were dug up in fields and in other places, and they were antiquarians who were interested in China's past, and they called it a taotie, and they thought it was a glutton or some kind of monster because he didn't have a bottom, he doesn't have a chin. We'll see it more clearly. It looked a bottom part to his mouth, that he was a glutton. He had to have such a big mouth. He had to eat a lot. So that these were some of the things surrounding these vessels, and what no one, not as I said, understanding fully the context and what they represented. Can I have the next, please? And these are two more examples. This is a gu, which has a mark on it again. And this is called a wine beaker. And the one on the right is a wine vessel for pouring wine. And these vessels had different functions, which were part of the ritual, which we will be discussing, just to give you an idea. But they were beautiful, elegant vessels that were extraordinarily beautifully cast. And as I said, were an amazing discovery to have such sophisticated casting techniques, as I said. And it was a question as to where did this influence come from? What were they associated with? There were texts which mentioned the Shang, but the question was, were they accurate? Were they really telling us about the dynasty that existed then? Can I have the next, please? Now, what happened was that this is the bottom of a tortoise, that large round, sort of oval shape with things written in it. And this is a tortoise plastron. That's the underside of a tortoise. And then the right side is a sheep scapula, the shoulder bone of a sheep or an ox. They use these bones. These were also found in the late 19th century. They became known as dragon bones because, again, no one knew what these symbols meant on the left side. I guess it's the left side of the screen with these incised symbols, and then you see T shapes to the right and the left, and they were the result of a hot poker of bronze being put on the back of the plastron or the tortoise and shell, tortoise shell, and then or the sheep shoulder. And what would happen is that the emperor would ask a question, the ruler, the dynasty, which turned out to be the Shang Dynasty. The people did, would ask questions, and then there would be answers. And those T shapes were created by the bronze poker that would cause a crack, and the crack would be read by the priest shaman, all of which I will be explaining. But when they found these, they didn't know what they were. So the pharmacists in the medicine makers in China in the 19th century would grind them up and use them and call them dragon bones as a component for the medicine. And then eventually they were discovered that someone recognized the fact that those symbols on the bottom of the plastron of the tortoise shell were actually the earliest known Chinese characters, which is very, very important because Chinese language and the characters themselves are such a hallmark of the of the culture of China. Can I have the next, please? And this gentleman, Wan Yirong, is credited with, he was born in Shanghai. He was director of the Imperial Academy, as we said, and he had malaria. So he went to find out a remedy or some medicine, and he saw these bones before they were ground up into some kind of medicine, and these unusual symbols, and he became very interested. And he was the one that recognized that they were the ancestor or the earlier versions of Chinese characters. Can I have the next, please? And then a major change happened in the 1927 and 30s with the Japanese invasions, and before that, they were excavating. They decided to do an excavation in the Anyang area, which you can visit today in Henan province. This was an area that they found a lot of bronzes, but also found a lot of bone fragments, and they excavated, and to their surprise, they had found this amazing discoveries of this was actually a burial ground which was part of the capital of the last capital of the Shang Dynasty. So now Shang it was the last and the largest capital of the dynasty. And this was a place that 12 generations of kings were buried, of the rulers were buried here, and they found these huge cemeteries. And these are the late, however, as I said, the last capital. There were other earlier capitals around there and in areas further away from Anyang before this, but this was a very major discovery, and now Shang became a real historic period, and they could learn a lot from the excavations and from the tombs. And this also points to two levels of the practice of in a sense of ritual and art and religion, in that you have the burial practices, which were one level, and then the other was the practice of divination and the role of the emperor as the political leader, who also indulged in very important rituals, both being dedicated to the ancestors. Can I have the next, please? Now, these are just some of the discoveries, just some of the pictures, these sort of cross-shaped, as you see on the left, and then these smaller ones on the right. But the left side, those are the main tombs, the main large imperial tombs, and then you see some on the right as well. And they're different cemeteries that were near the capital. They did find rammed earth ledges, and they found walls, and they did find some, not at the cemeteries, but further away they did find evidence of buildings that were probably part of the city of Shang, what they call post holes that were left by the wooden structures. But what you see here on the right is also those tiny little burials were also people that were sacrificed and buried with the king or the emperor at the time. So that you had, and also the workmen who probably dug the tombs were then buried. So what you had was those long arms that stick out, or the north-south axis, the longest ramps on the bottom, and then towards the top, those are the sloping ramps that enter into the tomb. And then you have the center, which is where the number is in the middle, which is several levels of rammed earth. And this was the technique that was used to build the Great Wall in the beginning, where you tamp this yellow earth soil called earth. It's a very powdery soil that blows off of the Mongolian plain. And if you pound it with and put a wooden form, walls, and then you fill the between the walls, you fill the earth with the yellow earth, and you stamp it, it becomes hard and really very effective. It stands up against the weather, and it was a very and it changes the density so much that when you find a tomb, you will also be able to find it now by using sound, because it has a different sound, the pounded earth from the regular earth. Now, the one thing I also wanted to emphasize is that okay, let's go to the next, and then I'll come back to that point. And here's a view of them now as they exist, and they're in the area of the burials. There was originally a small area for sacrifices, which would be made to the deceased, because the rulers who died then became the imperial ancestors, who then had to be treated appropriately with the ritual and the rites that were appropriate to the living having a communication with the ancestors. So that was a very important part of this process of the connection between the past and the present, was through the ancestors and through this communication of the spirit, and the communication was in the form of these elaborate rituals using these bronze vessels. So we're going to come back to some of this, but I wanted to emphasize the point again. And in China, that the word Zhao, which is used is translated in the West as religion, as I mentioned in the first lecture, was really meant teaching, or of passing on of knowledge, of teaching. So you could teach people to believe in the ancestor spirits, or an idea of a deity, or you could also teach them how to behave towards each other in society, such as moral values and appropriate behavior. And there was no distinction made between those two, that believing in a deity was a religion, and then following rules of conduct and morality were not a religion, but they were treated equally. And there was no distinction made between the two, a theistic religion and the moral teachings of the sages, which we now talk about, Confucius and others later. But there were guidelines about behavior at this point as well, so that you have but the one very important expression in both as we'll talk about, the morality as well as the deities, was the ancestor spirits, who were all powerful. In fact, you were more powerful dead than alive, because the ancestors were believed to have enormous power, so that being appropriate in your rituals was crucial. And the belief in ancestor worship and honoring your ancestors or your predecessors, whether they were the royal ones as they were in the Shang, and later on your family ancestors, was a universal quality that was the predominant form in China. There was no other sort of universal religion quite like that, so or practice like ancestor worship. So I have the next, please. And we can look down into the tombs, and we're going to be talking about this. The Shang tombs, these are just a few, and they were discovered in 1934, and these were 14 family members, and there were different regions, and there were sacrificial pits, as I mentioned, which have humans in them as well. Now here, this is the tomb itself. So there's the sloping approaches, and this one has 4 sloping approaches that you saw there that look like a cross. And you can see the earth is different because it's pounded so hard. It's different from the earth that covered them. And then down in the deep hole in the left is another hole, which you can't really see. And there's a dog placed there. That was to be the dog that helped the deceased make the transition into the ancestor realm. And then you have the actual burial of the deceased in that pit. And then on the right and left side are sacrificial people. They could be his they could be slaves, which they did have captured slaves from their various conquering of regions around the Shang Dynasty, because it didn't occupy all of China as we know it today. They could have been retainers or other people that were sacrificed with the deceased. And these tombs were really large, 10 feet deep, 22 feet, sometimes even much larger than that. This is just an example of it. And most of these tombs that they found in the Shang, though, had been robbed. And that's where probably some of the bronze vessels that were around that people didn't know where they came from were from some of these tombs. So some things were left in the tombs and others were not. But one of the most important parts were the bones, the dragon bones, as they're called. Could I have the next, please? And here we see the one I showed you, the scapula and the tortoise shell. And as I said, what they found, these are burials that they found on the left and right that look like it looks like a giant egg. It's sort of a hole, and it was considered to be a library of these plastrons and other bones from the Shang Dynasty when they were used in divination. Now, so divination is part of this ritual that was related to talk to the ancestor worship. And so that what they would do is they would pose a question. Are we going to have good crops this year? Are we going to have rain this year? And then the shaman priest, who was the advisor to the emperor, would then write this on the plastron. That would be these Chinese characters, early forms of Chinese characters you saw, then turn it over, and then you burn it with this iron poker, and it would crack a certain way, and only the priest shaman could read the crack, what the answer was, and then they would write the answer onto the bone. So this was a huge advantage to finding this enormous library, because it gave so much information, but it took a long time to be able to coordinate the ancient forms of the characters to the modern ones that we know today. So you have they found 17,000 in one of these pits, with all of it, sort of a library of great of this activity that went on, of this discussion with the ancestors. You might ask, are we going to win the war against the Shu people that are south of Anyang? Or are we going to, have an earthquake? These were all questions, and this was vitally important because it was two roles. The emperor was responsible for conducting these conversations or connections with the ancestor spirits, but it also this role he has the political power was vested in him as the ruler. And if things happen, terrible things happen, like a great flood or a great famine or whatever, the emperor was blamed for it, because it was believed that his behavior was inappropriate, that he must have broken some of the accepted standards that he was supposed to follow. He didn't do the right sacrifices, or didn't do them at the right time, or he drank too much, or there were other issues. So he was also, it was both, it had political implications as well as ritual implications for the Shang Dynasty. So it was basically, ruled by the emperor, and then he had his lords and sort of aristocrats who had land and power around them, and their power was also vested in the fact that they controlled bronze. They had bronze weapons, and they had bronze, their land could be farmed by slaves or by the commoners, who then had bronze tools, and this made them more efficient. The rest of the general population did not have bronze, so that gave them the advantage also of power, but through having bronze, which we will now talk about more of. But these were very critical for establishing the identity of the Shang Dynasty, and this is the second half of the Shang, not the earlier period, but also of the identification of the Chinese language. Can I have the next, please? And here I'm just showing you this chart, that some of the oracle bone script, and then the different forms of how they ended up being the more abstracted forms, which were based, some of them were based very directly on um, almost pictograph-like forms, but not all. And there were also very early symbolic combinations of things. But this clearly was the earliest form of writing, although now they've discovered some markings in the Neolithic period as well, but that's unclear whether they're markings of the person who made the vessel or they're actually characters. So in any event, but this was a major, major change in our understanding of Chinese, um, early Chinese culture, because of the ritual practice and also of the establishment of the language at such an early period. And of course, later on, writing becomes a symbol of power as well, because it was a sign of the educated and those who were in the ruling class. Could I have the next, please? Now, these are just two examples from Anyang that were found. Now, the government of Chiang Kai-shek, who then eventually fled China, these are now in the Academic Synagogue in Taipei because they were part of the excavations, and they packed up all this material from Anyang and they shipped it over to Taiwan. But these are two large, very large vessels that weigh tons, but it shows a kind of deer-like with these big horns on the figure. Well, this creature again, the taotie in the center, and these bird-like creatures on the side, and the centrality of these of the image of the taotie that we are going to see as being one of the great characteristics of the Shang vocabulary. And what did this mean? And how was it created and represented? Now, their primary role, where it was a symbol, of course, of the emperor's power and his royal power, because of the patriarchal system, the importance of the ancestors, and his role in as that point. He was the point of which communication with the ancestors, as I said already. And having that, when you transfer power from one emperor to the other, it was believed that there were 9 ding, these big square vessels, which were a symbol of the transfer of power. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to what they were used for. Were they used for animal sacrifices as part of the ritual for honoring the ancestors? Can I have the next, please? And this is the deer-like creature with this sort of, his still a taotie, but he's got these ears and some antlers, which make him look more deer-like. And you see the birds on either side of the taotie, deer taotie in the center, and then these animals marching across the top. But everything, you have a large band for the taotie, and you have on the legs, you have additional designs as well. But these are just 2 of the examples which were found at Anyang. Now we're going to go on to talk more. And as again, it's question as to whether this was a sacrifice that were deer, cooked in here, were sacrificed in here, because they're, I wish I had the exact measurements, but they're huge, big enough to hold an animal. I mean, they're that large, and they weigh thousands of tons. So just the casting of these is an extraordinary accomplishment as well. And for many years, there have been, until the discovery of other sites, that the question was, did the Chinese invent this casting process, or did they get influence from the West? So that was one of the debates that always raged for years, until more recent excavations in the 20th century and in the end of the 20th century changed that whole view by, as we'll see. Could I have the next, please? Now, this is an assembly of objects of bronze. They call it the Duanfang altarpiece, because this altarpiece, they call it an altarpiece of bronze vessels, which was in the 14 vessels, which were in an assemblage on this base. And it was belonged to a prominent, as it says, government official, an antiquarian. It's in the Metropolitan, and when you go visit, you can take a look at it. Now, they're mostly Shang date, or just early to the next period, early Western Zhou, because the following dynasty basically carried on much of what the Shang Dynasty believed in and carried on with. So they're a little, it clearly was not found in an excavated Shang tomb, but that the vessels were assembled, but the base and this base, it seems to be what might have been one of the kinds of displays for bronze vessels that were part of some of the ceremonies to honor the ancestors, because um, along with divination of communicating, you had offerings to the ancestors, which these vessels had several roles, as we saw the one there that looks like a goblet, that's for drinking wine. The one to the left of it is for pouring wine, others for storing wine, and for food. So they were clearly used for some kind of a offerings to the ancestors, and also at the funeral of the emperor or one of his family or one of the aristocrats, there would be a feast which would be offered to the ancestor spirit of that who recently departed. So feasting with the ancestors was also a very, very important part of this process or ritual, which was all bound together by the whole idea of the power of the ancestor and of lineage, of connecting to the past and the present. So that this, again, there's a lot of discussion as to where these pieces may have come from, etc., and whether, and was this an altar, or was it a display as part of the ritual? It's not clear. I mean, there's still lots of questions that have not been answered, but we get more information, though, as we look and begin to piece these things together. Can I have the next, please? Now, this is just, again, a diagram which shows you they're not all, the shapes are not all from the Shang Dynasty, because these bronze vessels were used all the way through to the Han Dynasty, but the ritual use of vessels went through the Zhou period in terms of part of these elaborate rituals, and the shapes change, and the changing shapes and the changing decoration um, indicate the changing of rituals and different ideas that are become associated with ancestor worship. So we'll be able to see the evolution of the ritual as through the bronzes, through the iconography, as we go through the next several discussions and of the in the course. So we see, though, that they're categorized by food cookers, food containers, water vessels, and wine containers, wine goblets, wine warmers, so that and wine pouring, so that you could see how they were definitely dedicated to some kind of elaborate feasts, which were, or often food would be set out in part of the ritual to, essentially the sending the fumes and the smell and the food to the ancestor spirits above. And all of the the effort was towards these ancestor spirits that existed in this realm of the spirits. So we can see that different functions, and they often talk about how these, like the food cookers with the handles that are like rounded shapes that you could stick a pole through, so you could put it in the fire to heat it up and then remove it from the fire. So the different functions seemed, and then the containers, the food would be then poured into the containers. And the same with the water. There is a basin which might have been used for cleansing hands. These are holding the wine and then pouring the wine, so you could warming the wine and then pouring the wine. So wine was a very important part. And actually, in some of the later excavations we'll talk about in the Zhou period, they have found containers of wine from the 5th century, 11th century BCE that has survived in the tombs as well. So next, please. Now, talking about iconography, this is sort of one of the best known images that often associated with early China, the taotie. As I mentioned, there is no indication on the oracle bones. Now, there are scholars who've been working on translating the oracle bones and creating a huge library of information about the Shang, about what the words mean, about names that are mentioned. They do mention some of the emperor's names. They mention one important queen who was named Fu Hao, which we'll talk about a little later about her tomb. But this taotie has been the discussion, under discussion for many, 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 if since these vessels appeared, as to what um, is the taotie. And as we can see, it's a kind of mask-like creature. He has the mask being the emphasis on the eyes, their eyebrows on some of them, as you can see on the right, and the design is in relief. But the as we'll talk about with the casting technique, it's a very complicated casting of surface because there are spiral designs in the background which are called thunder pattern, which if it is or not, we symbolize thunder, nobody's sure, but the character looks something like the ancient character looks something like thunder. These are names that were given by scholars, and it's never quite sure whether they're totally accurate. But in any event, you have a background, then you have this horn, which is raised up, in relief. But if you look at the surface of the horn, it's not just in one layer of relief. It's a little bit, it rises up and then sinks a little bit where that line is in the center of the horn, and then the ends of the horn rise up a little bit more. So it's several levels of relief as well. So and you could see the eyes are higher relief, the eyebrows are higher relief on the vessel. And then this is a flange, that bar right down the middle between the two eyes, that raised part. You could see it on the left with the T shapes, which look like the shapes that were on the oracle moans. Anyway, these flanges are a result of the casting technique, which I will explain, because they had to assemble the moles, and these were the places where the moles were joined. So they incorporated the mold casting technique into the actual decor of the bronzes. And these dominate the vessel. It's on the body of the vessel. It's the central part of the vessel. And the fascination, and you have the taotie, its centrality, its bilateral symmetry, it's symmetrical. On their quadrants, there are 4 quadrants. There's another taotie on the other side, and it's exactly the same, and it's divided. So you have these flanges dividing this into 4 zones. And we do know that even in early on the Shang bones, the oracle bones, they mention the 4 directions of the universe, 4 east, west, north, south, and center as being, part of it. And then the thunder pattern, but also this idea of duality, because which I have not written down. If you look at the flange in the center of the bronze on the right, if you look to the left or the right of it, you will look, it's a kind of what they call dragon-like creature from the side. The one eye, an eyebrow, and the flange, the teeth form the mouth of this creature, whose body goes back and then rises up and curls around. But then when you look at it frontally, it's a creature, it looks like a mask with the body splayed out on both sides. So this duality of imagery is very characteristic in the Neolithic, but also it becomes very important here. And duality is something that becomes a characteristic of Chinese culture, religion, and in ritual as well. So these were extraordinarily complicated casting techniques, which were, many people were in awe of, and it took years and years and years in the mid 20th century in the Academia Sinica in Taiwan. They tried to replicate the technique of the casting, and it took many, 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 many years to even get close to the skill that's demonstrated here. So their fangs, and then you have their eye, then these claws. So the claws are both part of this mask-like creature, as well as part of the claws of these 2 dragon-like creatures, which are facing into the flange. So you have the duality, the bilateral symmetry, and the centrality of this, which indicates that this was clearly an important symbolic figure and part of the ritual. And now they believe they can associate it with what they call Shang Di, who was the supreme ancestor that was being worshipped by the, and by the emperor on the behalf of his people. Could I have the next, please? So we could see it here. I've separated it so that you could see up here with the flange and the bottom, you could see the creature on the side who then has a kind of crest as well as an ear and his body to the left. So you can see this kind of balance and duality between the imagery that it can be read in several different ways. In this case, the duality being important and the bilateral symmetry. And so they now feel that this is a dominant, powerful creature with the eyes being so prominent, and this that this is, can be identified as Shang Di, this sort of supreme ancestor. And again, of course, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of variation in terms of interpretation, but this certainly was part of the this ritual practice that was dedicated and evolved towards the ancestors. Can I have the next, please? Now, this Taotie mask, as we can see on the left, this is also from a bronze vessel, and you can see that spiral pattern in the back, which is lower relief, and that is what they call the thunder pattern. And you can see the again, this doesn't have a flange, it's a smaller vessel, but it has you could still, if you draw a line down the middle of the snout, you will again get the duality, not necessarily as prominently. But I chose this one because it also reflects back to the ancient, to the Neolithic culture before. This is about 2000 BC, 2500 BC. It's a jade sun, or a square tube, which has four sides. They stick out four sides, again, emphasizing the four directions of the universe. And you see elements that relate to the Taotie. So it's possible that the idea of Shang Di, or the idea of the supreme ancestor, emerges earlier towards the end of the Neolithic period. And this period, called the Black Pottery culture, it also was highly sophisticated technological accomplishment, like the carving of this jade. This jade is known as being such a resistant material, and to get such fine articulation is at this early stage is quite an accomplishment. So we see the technical accomplishments as well. So I put the question mark Shang Di because, again, as I said, some scholars, the majority of scholars now accept that idea, but some still don't completely feel that there's enough information on the oracle bones to make it official that this is Shang Di. But I think the majority pretty much assume it is, and I think there's pretty good reason to come to that conclusion. Now you see above this Taotie, there are these small creatures that are little dragon-like creatures, which are believed that eventually to be the ancestor to the dragons, which become so, again, identified with Chinese culture. Have the next, please. Now, the next important aspect of the iconography, we have Shang Di, who was this important, this dominant image. And we will see in the next period, Western Zhou, the Taotie remains a central and important figure, but it begins to change, and the iconography changes, and it indicates a shift in the way ancestors are seen. It doesn't change ancestor worship, but it does change in some of the ritual. So this is why this is the point of our discussion, of kind of get a sense of how the art express these ideas that we can see, visualize in these images, in these objects, as well as some of the writings that have now been preserved on these dragon bones. Now, animals were a very important link, and in the Shang, it's dominated by mythological animals or combined animals. In other words, they're fantastic creatures that are clearly beyond the normal animal scope, which means it has by many cultures, they borrow different parts of animals and put them together to make a more powerful image or powerful creature. And some of that happens here, but many, and then you have many totally mythological animals, and occasionally a real animal will creep into the vocabulary, as we'll see. So, and divination was a part of it is not, is in talking to the ancestors, is the communication was made through the bones of animals, as we talked about, through the tortoise, through the sheep scapula, ox scapula. And this is, so important to the whole character of the ancient Bronze Age in China, in the Shang and the Zhou. And these rites, everything was connected to their, people, the lords and the emperor joining their ancestors. And these mythological animals, conceptual too, because they were, as I said, they were conceived in these fantastic forms as agents between the world of man and the world of the gods, in this sense, the spirits of the ancestors. So you can read about that in more detail with Zhang Guangzhi, who was an early archaeologist and then spent most of his time here at Yale and at Harvard, discusses this whole question about the importance of animals in this vocabulary of these rituals that were constructed through these bronze vessels and through the bones and through the use of the political power of the ruler, as well as the shamans. And you needed the shamans. They had to be consulted to make sure that the rituals were appropriately executed, because then if they weren't, it would cause disharmony. And one of the great, with the bilateral symmetry, you see, harmony or balance was very much a goal of the Chinese culture, civilization in the Shang, and it remains one of them throughout the history. They talk about harmony, and this sense of balance in the world. So, can I have the next, please? Now, just as a way of emphasizing, these are later paintings on silk that come from the 4th century. They were found in the tombs between the wooden structures inside the tomb, so that they were preserved. But what they show us again are pictures of later shamans, so that the shaman remains an important part of the culture, although Confucius wasn't so happy about shamans when he developed his theory of how harmony could be achieved in the period of the Warring States by harmony and by social mores and social behavior. But these shamans were very important throughout in early Chinese history and culture. And you see the male figure riding on a dragon and the female figure riding on a phoenix. So these early symbols, that the symbol of the dragon attached to the emperor, and then the phoenix attached to the empress, and the male female relationship, you see them here, riding them and controlling them. And these were remained very, very powerful. And they were it was a role that was handed down. You were born into a family that had had shamans, and you would become the word shaman, or they use it as a combination, shaman or priest, but the word for shaman is wu, which means dancing, is associated with dancing, which of course some kind of dancing and music were also associated with these kinds of rituals, as far as we could tell. So these are some later examples, but these are shamans which remained, and they're mentioned in the oracle bones, a very important part of the advisory to the emperor, that his behavior and his execution of the rituals had to be appropriate and had to be right, or else it would cause disharmony and disruption. So you might lose the war, or people might be killed, or there might be a famine, or there might be a storm, a flood. So that was his role, was to do this. And he also the emperor had to make trips to the temple of heaven and the temple of earth to maintain, again, balance and connection. Could I have the next, please? Now, this role of animals is fascinating, because on the bronze vessels, they are largely animal creatures of, as I said, both some references to real animals, that like the snake that comes to the top of the head between the horns and curls around. And this particular vessel is extraordinary because it has inlaid turquoise as well. The body of the snake is defined, the texture of the snake skin is defined by these inlays of turquoise. So you have a snake-like creature curling around this part, and you have the handle becomes an animal with horns, and the front you have a creature with teeth and eyes, but again animal-like, but beyond that, in terms of identifying exactly what kind of animal it is remains beyond the intention of creating these powerful mythological creatures. Now this has this is a top, and it's a wine vessel that you could pour wine out of, and they exist in various forms. And the next one is one of the most, I believe, is one of the most famous. Could I have the next, please? It's among those also in the Metropolitan, but you can see how things transform. They go from one animal into the next. So you have the wing, then it turns into this sort of spiral with the head. You have the underneath the neck, this hook, which is part of it could be a raptor, eagle, associated with any number of animals, but they often transform from one animal to the next and adopt another part of the animal. And this one is in the Met. I don't know if, I believe it's on view, but you have these references to real animal-like characteristics, but put all together as they transform from wing to a dragon-like creature, become something else. So the importance of animals, mythological as well as the occasional dash of real animal, was essential to the iconography of these ritual vessels. So the taotie and the animals, and it's such imaginative combinations. They vary so much from vessel to vessel. Now, one of the things that's fascinating about this is that when you make these bronzes, which we will discuss next in how you cast them, when you make them, the mold had to be broken. So no two bronzes in the Shang Dynasty are identical. There was no repeat mold use. You couldn't just take the mold and put it together again and use it. You had to break it. So that adds to the amazing part of this, that they are so extraordinarily varied and had so much imagination in them. Could I have the next, please? And here we see this sort of combination of the animals again, and this is a owl, sort of a beaked bird-like creature. And again, the wing transforms into a snake-like creature. And when you look at the back, this is a taotie underneath the handle, and then another eyed creature down there, and then there's the tail. The other interesting thing about the animals are that they stand, you see their toes or their claws do not really officially touch the ground. They stand on these rocks, which separate them from the real world in a sense. They're not standing on the earth. They're standing on these sort of rock-like or these sort of maybe rocks or earth or what, but they don't dig into the ground. They don't press on the earth, so you don't feel their feet pressing into the ground plane that they're standing on here, which makes them again separate them from the earth, the real world, and the fantastic spirit world of these creatures. And this one, you could spend hours, these little birds, I mean, just constantly changing, and it's just a menagerie of imagination and animals. And again, you get these sort of illusions and kind of suggestive qualities of real animals that you might recognize, like an owl face on the back from the side, but then it looks like a taotie-like creature on the front. When you look at it head on, this constant changing and transformation. But if you notice, they always tend to have bilateral symmetry when you look at them from the front. What's on one side is on the other side. So that balance is very important as well. Now, this one happens to come from a wonderful tomb of Fu Hao. This is one of the first tombs discovered in 1976 of this late Shang period, which the end of the last couple of 100 years of the Shang, which was undisturbed. and they found over 200 bronze vessels and incredible amounts of jade. She was the wife of the last emperor, and she was a warrior who led armies into battle. But it's the first undisturbed tomb, so it was just full of these incredible vessels of such high quality, dazzling in their iconography, but also in their technology. Could I have the next, please? This is a drawing of her tomb on the left, and the one on the right shows some of what was there in the tomb, but they eventually emptied it. But you see, there is a kind of platform there where some of the vessels were put on top of, suggesting that that was that one I showed you from the Met, that was perhaps a small altar of, for offerings. And you see there on the left and the right, there are these skeletons, which were again offerings, human beings killed and offered to the spirits in the next world. Could I have the next, please? So 200 ritual vessels and 750 pieces of jade. So it was an extraordinary, and she was the queen, and she was his wife. She was a warrior. It's hard to imagine what was in the actual emperor's tombs, which they've never found undisturbed. So those tombs we look at, whatever is found in them, there's only a skeletal remains of what must have been extraordinary numbers of riches in the tombs. The other thing I want to mention, in those tombs on the walls, particularly those ones of the emperors, they actually already had invented lacquer. The walls had lacquer paintings on them, which of course have been destroyed through the dampness, and they chipped off the walls. But there are some remains of patterns in the some of the wooden pieces that were in the tomb, as well as on the walls, that the stamped earth captured the images that were sort of the form of what was left there. So again, everybody thought for years that lacquer was invented in the like 5th, 6th century BCE, but it was already there in 1200 BCE in these tombs. But again, this is that wonderful animal, sort of bird-like creature, parrot-like creature that almost feels like a parrot in terms of the beak, etc., in the front. But other materials were also found in tombs or in architectural contexts. Like this is found in Anyang, and it has a slit in the back, which they believe some of these were used for supports of wooden or embellishments for the post and lintel system, the posts that held up the buildings in the Shang capital. But this is a marble structure, marble owl-like creature, fairly more owl-like, and then more specific. But again, the wings turn into snakes and other creatures, so that the vocabulary, no matter what you decorated, had this continuity to it. And you notice the feet, again, do not stand on the ground. The claws are grasping either blocks of wood, blocks of, stone, well, in this case, stone, or indicating, again, the separateness from their contact with the earth. Can I have the next, please? And these are some of the jades that were found in the tomb. And you'll notice outstanding right there is the elephant, who's the most realistic animal that is found in this in the imagery in the tombs, but it is decorated with the spirals, the curls, and the ears like the taotie. It has the same kind of decoration on the surface that everything else has, even though the figure is more naturalistic than the others. You have a tiger-like creature here, and perhaps a dragon-like creature here that's curled. Now, these are very small jades. They're only about 2 to 4 inches long, if not smaller. And elephants did exist in northern China at this time. They disappear before the Han, and then they are given as gifts in the 5th century to the Northern Wei emperors, and so they reappear sometimes in the iconography or in the drawings and decoration in the Northern Wei. And of course, the often in Northern Way, elephants are always associated with Buddhism, but here, here we just have an elephant, which must have been, even though they were existing in the North, probably a very special animal and quite exotic and powerful. And you see the big, flat ears and those incised drawings of spirals and um, curls and forms that we see that make up the taotie are repeated over and over again. Could I have the next, please? Now, the other aspect of animals are man and animals. Now, by and large, the number of human representations found in the Shang and even earlier are very small, almost, I mean, non-existent. In fact, you have a bronze vessel that has a big face on it that is a human face, but or maybe not a human face. It could be a spirit's face, but this one has always caused a great deal of discussion and um, variation of opinion because of it's a bronze vessel that looks as if it's eating a human being, or is it protecting the human being, whose legs are splayed on either side of the creature, and arms on either side of the creature's head, and the mouth is wide open, and they're very fairly, impressive teeth there hanging over the head. So their scholars have been debating back and forth: is he eating or protecting the human? And that one has not been resolved. It goes back and forth and back and forth. There are representations occasionally of small figures in the Fuhao tomb which look as if they might be slaves. Um, that are represented, or other perhaps attendant-like figures, but they're very small, but they're not many, maybe two or three. So human figures done either in jade at this point, or in this case, we have one here in bronze, are extremely rare. And humans were really subservient in their relationship to these animals and to this ritual bronzes and to the taotie. There clearly were not, the emphasis on the life was for the again imperial and aristocratic classes, were on the emphasis with this relationship with uh, earth, heaven, and the ancestor gods. Obviously, the people who were uh, the people, the farmers, and those who were trying to eke out a living may have had uh, modest uh, interest in connecting with their ancestors, but clearly their tombs are very simple when they're found. They're just pits with very little in it, maybe a clay pot. But in any event, this one, as I said, it's got animals standing on the head. They've got these incredible ears, and again, it's a melange, a kind of fusion of all these animals coming together, different pieces and parts, and imaginative as well as feline-like or deer-like, but never quite reaching the standard of realistic. And again, his feet do not touch the ground officially in terms of pressing. The human foot is pressing on the animal foot, but the animal's claws again are grasping on, standing on uh, a surface. Can I have the next, please? And this is one of the great ones that has again puzzled people in terms of what role this kind of an image would be. Again, it has a slot in the back which suggests it may have been pushed up to a piece of architecture. Maybe it was a guardian. But what's very interesting is that they call it Tiger Man because even though the front may look like, the open mouth of a feline like a tiger or a lion, and these but the patterns again are the kinds you find on bronzes, and they have big claws, but the way this creature is sitting is human. That's not the way an animal would sit. So that its shoulders, waist, legs, even arms, except for the claws, are very human-like. Now, is he wearing a mask? Is it a half human, half animal creature? Um, and what role did this kind of a creature play in this process? It could have been protective, as I said, if it were pushed up against it, a vertical post in a building. It might maybe at the entrance, maybe inside the throne room as a protective creature. It's not clear. so that there's still lots of mysteries that maybe as they continue to translate the 17,000, the words on the 17,000 pieces of oracle bones, they may find an answer. Because lots of documentation from the later periods in Chinese history, like, the history of the Zhou dynasty, or even the Shang, were written after the dynasties. So it's very unclear how accurate some of the information is, or how much they, it's not to say it's all inaccurate, but there wasn't a lot of information certainly about what these meant and what these mean. It was more about the history and documenting the dynastic events. Could I have the next, please? Now, we've talked about the taotie, and I meant to emphasize the fact that it was conceived of, like a curled horn, spirals, and lines and patterns. And you see these all occur like in other materials as well in the Shang Dynasty. We saw it on the jades. We saw it here. We see it on bone. This is a carved cup with a bone that has the same kind of beak-like creature head here, and has it's hard to see, a taotie-like creature at the bottom. It's inlaid with turquoise. This comes from Fu Hao's tomb, and these are white uh, ceramic vessels, and they're stoneware, which means that they are higher fired than the ceramics from the earlier Neolithic, which were earthenware, and they were never fired high enough to become stoneware, which makes them the kind of material that you have often coffee cups, with mugs made out of today, the stoneware. And they're not porcelain, which is very thin and fine. This is a white porcelain-like clay. These are white pottery you have the zigzag, but in between them you see the spirals of the thunder pattern again. And on the shoulder you have these dragon-like creatures, and some of them have eyes that resemble the taotie put up there as well. And on the sides you have taotie-like masks, or even sometimes rabbit-like masks. And so that the materials reflected a coherence in the decoration, would suggest that there was a kind of, a meaning to, it symbolized something really important, power of the ancestors of various kinds of things. And again, people have been discussing what these forms and decorative, or you want to call them the decor, the iconography of the imagery on these means. It's something that continues to intrigue and encourage. The right side is a Shang Dynasty stoneware, which again indicates that they had achieved a very high level of sophistication in terms of pottery making. And there is some evidence that there might have even been some early glazing, which may have been an accident because of the ash in the kiln. But it has this one, the pottery. This is quite simple in terms of horizontal ridges that go all the way to the top, but beautifully formed pot. So these two, we see all these other materials that were used and displayed the same sort of image, a central iconography of what the Shang people believed needed to be on these important vessels for part of their ancestor worship. Could I have the next, please? But bronze is the most important subject, the most important material and object. And of course, as I mentioned, last time, music plays a part in ritual always. And we have here bells. They often were found in three. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has three now bells, and they were played upside down like this. You have a small tapper, and you tap the bronzes in different places, and they give you different notes. This one has a little square or inscription on it, but you see the taotie here, and you see the eyes here. But you see this constant use of spirals, of thunder pattern in the background, of layers of relief, all part of this way of expressing the power of these images. And now this is a chime, a stone chime, which was hung and then also tapped and to produce different kinds of sound as part of the musical accompaniment to these what must have been ceremonies and festive feasts for either departed ancestors or the communication with the Shangdi, the high ancestor in the universe. but you again see these, repetitive spiral patterns, a kind of almost vocabulary. I know someone who cataloged all these different spiral-like patterns because they are repetitive. It's like there's a small book that they must have known what was appropriate to put on different things. Could I have the next, please? And then we have weapons, which are another form, which are half bronze and half other materials. These are jade blades, and you have bronze handles, sort of a halberd-like one on the right, and then the blade, the knife blade on the left. And this also would have been attached like this, a halberd-like, and these are all inlaid with turquoise, meaning that the turquoise was a highly prized substance, and most of this comes from Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is extremely rich in. But in terms of actual location in China, I'm not sure where they were getting in Shang. They could have been getting it, traveled across. It's not clear. But these were not usable for war. These were actually ceremonial. They're very thin. They're not really sharp enough to do much damage, but they were used at court they could have been status symbols. They could have been part again of the ceremony, part of the honor guard of the emperor, but they all partake of the same kind of decoration that we've been seeing, the decor of putting what they were putting on them, which must have added to their power as well as to their beauty. Could I have the next, please? Now, I wanted to come before we end to the making of the vessels. Now, this is a very unusual form of casting in that it's piece mold casting made with clay. The Chinese have always had an extraordinary command of the technology of clay in making, we know in the history of ceramics and inventing porcelain and all kinds of various glazes, etc. So clearly we saw that they made stoneware already. So they made these piece molds, which were clay, which were then fired and then assembled. So where they were assembled, so this line on the right-hand side, this is a very early ding, which had hollow legs, which allowed whatever was in there to go into the legs as well. You have a line going down the side. That's where the moles joined. And then there's a line under the bottom where the three pieces of them, where the piece of the moles from the legs meet. So these are you see the large pieces to the side and the two on the top. These are all piece molds. And I in the reading, I put a description of how this was done. And they would pour it and they'd have separators, which would give the space for the hot bronze to be poured. And this now also has part of the belief system at this time. Now, again, you see these examples I'm showing you now are earlier than this Anyang period. They're very early Shang or period. They are when the bronze, they were learning or evolving their making of bronze. You see how thin the bronze is compared to what we've been looking at, and we'll see some other examples. And the decoration is a single band with a taotie in the middle, and then these spirals. Now they're raised lines, they're like raised threads. And what that means is that they carved the design into the clay directly, you see around here, and then they poured the molten bronze. Now the making of bronze is in itself a kind of magical and powerful transformation, because you're taking copper and nickel and other material, but copper is one of the most important parts of it, and tin. So it's copper, tin, and then sometimes a little bit of nickel, and they would then transform this by heat to make it into bronze. So the transformative process was the fire, which transformed these earth minerals into a liquid, which then turned into metal, which is the bronze that we're seeing on the right. And these were very thin at the beginning, and the handles were not solid because they were, again, in a sense, these show that the Chinese actually developed these bronze techniques of casting over a period of time. And what we see at Anyang is the most sophisticated version of the bronzes, but these earlier ones show a certain amount of experimenting and the shapes being a little bit more tentative and not so elaborate because they were, in a sense, practicing. But this is a very difficult. So now, after you cast this bronze and it cools, and you have to break it, as I said, before you could take out the piece itself. So these bronzes are not, as I said, made with repetitive molds, which they learned how to do later in the Zhou period. Can I have the next, please? And see, you could see these are early examples of this pouring, this Jouet wine, warmer and then pourer. You see the very spindly legs. These are thicker legs. As they got more sophisticated, this also shows bronze that was bent, turned over after it was cast. They would pound it and work it with the mallets, the fold on the end there. And so the shapes, they were experimenting with shapes, and they were experimenting with the decor. And this is the same kind of decor we saw with thin raised threads, which were incised right into the mold. Can I have the next, please? And then here again, very simple, again, the legs being a little bit spindly and tentative. And again, you could see all these at the Met, but you could see the difference in terms of the level of sophistication and confidence in making them. And these are simple designs with a sort of attempt at a taotie here, putting it the eyes, but not, totally coherent yet. Can I have the next, please? So these all predate Anyang, but they show the fact that the Chinese were actually developed this casting techniques themselves. Now here, I picked this one because it's again a wine vessel, but if you look at the legs, straight back, the third leg, you can see some of the mold remained in some of the ceramic remained in the leg. And so they not able to remove it all. And you see two layers of the taotie again with the small flange in the middle, which was this would have been one of the mold seams. There's a mold seam under you could see it down the leg on the right side under the handle. There's a line that goes down the leg, this knife-like leg. And the designs now were wider bands, which were fatter. It was the opposite of the thin thread lines, big fatter bands. So they were moving forward to a more coherent and comprehensive dominant design. Could I have the next, please? And here you see these wide bands, all except for the eyes. Everything is more or less on the same level, wide bands with the spaces in between. The taotie with his horns, his eyes, his fangs, and his body, as we've seen. I also chose this one because you see they actually had to attach the handles. There must have been a problem with the handles not working in the original casting, and they attached them with these repairs, putting in almost like nails and attaching the handles, because it clearly was not a totally successful casting. But you can see how the design is becoming more dominant, more coherent, and again, bilateral symmetry with the flange in the middle. Could I have the next, please? And then the biggest change comes in, first of all, covering the whole base of the vessel with the two eyes over each leg in terms of the taotie on the left. But it's the final phase of development where the casting technique was extraordinarily complex, because you had to make a model of the bronze in clay with multiple layers of relief. You made an impression of that to make an impression in the mold. You couldn't work directly in the mold anymore because of the multiple levels of relief. So it was a very complex casting technique that finalized at the end of the Shang. You see this band of raised and multiple levels of relief, which make this so extraordinary and so compelling, because when you see them, you're drawn immediately to these two large eyes. And again, none of these, if you when you go see them in the museum, and if we get a chance to see them, you'll see that none of these are totally just flat bands. Not only are they're layered relief, the eyebrows on top of the band, but the ears, the horns, as I said, and parts of it are, you know, they go down and into a trough and they come up again, or the edges of the horn stick out more three-dimensionally. So it's very complicated, so that they made more complex molds, so that these flanges were where the mold pieces were joined at the end. So this represents Shang. This represents perhaps what they call middle Shang, a little earlier, and then the ones before early Shang. And what it says is that the Shang dynasty actually had several more hundred years over, and that what we're looking at is the final maturation of the civilization and of the practice of ancestor worship expressed in these bronze vessels, which were the most important, and then all the accoutrements, the other materials that were also covered with these kinds of spiral shapes and horn shapes and body shapes, because it clearly all related to this image of the Taotie, or who could be representing Shangdi. Could I have the next, please? We're almost at the end now. And of course, as I said, that he worshiped they mentioned the worshiping the four directions and heaven and earth. And this is now believed to be one of the earliest examples in the Anyang area of a stamped earth altar, which is the altar of heaven that's made out of stamped earth. And then you have the one that's the modern version, and then they have the square or stamped earth representation, the earth being square and the heaven being round. So a lot of the things that have become, essentially identified with Chinese culture in terms of the temple of heaven and the temple of earth and the four directions being so important, as well as the center, all started in very, very early, in the very earliest stages of the evolution of the culture. Okay, could I have the next, please? And we're at the end here. Now, this area you see on the tomb on the map, there's Anyang, there's Zhengzhou, there's Yanxi. These areas were the dominant part of the later Shang, the Shang area, which started small and then spread by Anyang. They controlled a fair amount of territory, but they were being challenged by groups of people coming from the west, which became the Zhou people. But the expansion of Shang culture, there were other cultures that existed, but the expansion of Shang culture suggests there was much more than we understood in the now. And they've been finding, especially in Chengdu and Sichuan, these finds that are really amazing, because they suggest a much more complicated culture than we and many different layers of this expression of representing the deity Shang and the Shangdi and the ancestor. Could I have the next, please? So that from the southwest here, these are the areas that we've been focusing on here, and then we're now looking down to the southwest. Sanxing Dui is one that was shown at the Met, is one of the most dazzling finds of Shang, a contemporary of Anyang at the time. Could I have the next, please? And these are amazing. Clearly, eyes were again important, as they were in the Shang, in the Taotie. And this is like, I don't know, 20 feet high, 10, I can't even, they're huge figures. And these have been found in Sichuan, and it parallels the time of Shang, and the techniques of the casting are the same, and some of the decorative motifs are the same, but they had these human-like representations of gods, but not quite totally human in the sense. Were they wearing masks? Were this part of their ritual? Were they shamans? What were they? We don't know. This is something that they're considering. Could I have the next, please? Then the last. And these are the most recent finds. This was found last year, the one on the right, which you could see covered the bronze head of probably a bronze head. And this is one that was found in the Shang Dynasty, in the Hunan right, not far from Anyang. So this is a new dimension, that there were other, perhaps a mask, perhaps covering another image that may have been an alternate way of representing Shangdi, or as part of the vocabulary. So we're now moving into and expanding our understanding, and it challenges us to see and understand. But there has been no real, I think there's definitely a coherence here to the ancestor worship remains central. The importance of both the spiritual uh, ritual part, as well as the and mixing both the spiritual part in the sense of the deities, or the Shangdi, the great ancestor, and the importance of appropriate behavior, which is part of the ritual, that you must do it properly, uh, remains really central to much of Chinese culture um, in this early Bronze Age, and continues later and takes different manifestations. But we're going to talk about that as we deal with the Zhou period. We can see the changes that happen in the representations of and how they worship ancestors, and how they see the world, which show up in the art. So we see the expression of these ideas of ritual and religion in the art again, and how it changes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Giuliano. Oh, that's a breadth of information. Well, we actually have a side discussion that's going on while during your presentation.
Okay.
Well, I want to open the floor, of course, well, to our audience before we go into the discussion for educators, for all the audience here. If any questions, well, please feel free to raise. You can either put your question in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself. I just want to also share what's happening, what's being discussed on the side, because, well, there's a fascination about a full house life. How do we know she's a warrior? And whether is it recorded in the oracle bones? So perhaps, well, Professor Giuliano, if you could share, give a little bit more.
Yes, she's mentioned, specifically mentioned, which is not that common in the oracle bones, as being an extraordinary warrior. And her tomb has a lot more weapons than you would have expected for a burial of a female. In other words, comparatively speaking, but she is mentioned. That's how they knew who it was, because her name is in the tomb, and it's in the oracle bones.
Mm-hmm. Just to follow up on that as well, I was listening to your mentioning of the Wu. There's a male figure, there's a female figure, and both are shamans, well, playing this roles, as well as Wu Fuhao being a woman warrior from the burial. What is the sort of both genders role during the time of Shang Dynasty? As well, we know that China in the traditional sense, well, it's being pretty much male-centered and patriotic, but it seems, well, at least, well, from some of the records from early China, well, there is a pretty important role or roles that women are playing and pretty prominently displayed. I wonder whether if it's a correct.
I think it's hard to evaluate. We know that in the Neolithic period, in certain areas of China, they were matriarchal societies. But the Shang is definitely patriarchal, and she's one of the few, at least, identified in that special way. So it's really hard to know whether this was typical, or she happened to be a very special woman who took over a role, and adopted and made a space for herself in a way that some special, extraordinary people do. So there's not enough evidence to really say how powerful women were, but it's not a cliche to say that there is still the question about, which happened all through Chinese history, about before women, ascended the throne, that there is the, the power behind the throne. So it's hard to know how the court operated in the Shang in terms of, you have the emperor, you have the advisors, how much influence the empress had or the wife had. It's hard to know. That's something that remains to be sort of more illuminated at this time.
Mhm.
Yes,
There's one more.
Fascinating figure. Everybody loves to think about her.
Indeed, indeed, especially where there's so much material as well,
Right.
sort of we can examine.
Mhm.
Yeah. There's another question regarding Shang Di,
Yes.
was referred as a supreme ancestor.
Mhm.
So is Shang Di, or was Shang Di originally human, or it's more of a mythical?
I don't think so. I don't. Well, that the only question it raises is to whether those figures in, San Xing Dui represent Shang Di in another way, but most consistently there wasn't any belief, as far as we know, of a human version of Shang Di. It's the, the spirit of the ancestor who then ascends, and there was a supreme ancestor who was the most powerful.
Mhm.
But as far as I know, there's no real sense that there was a human version ever.
Mhm. Yeah. There's another question, or when you were mentioning the human skeletons, discovered in the tomb. Were they killed alive for the burials, or
Yes.
do we know if?
Yes,
Yeah.
we know that they were sacrificed. That was part of the sacrifice to the ancestor as he made his journey or her journey into the realm of the, of the dead ancestors. So they were sacrificed alive. In fact, that human sacrifice continues on and off. Uh, Confucius was very much against this idea of human sacrifice. During Qin Huangdi, they have found, next to the, the wonderful armies that they found, there are 10,000 graves of which they believe were the workers were then killed and buried.
Mhm.
But during it kind of wanes in the Zhou period and into the Han in terms of human sacrifice, but in the Shang definitely.
Mhm. So I'm also looking at around on my screen. Any other questions from the audience? Or you can just unmute yourself. You don't have to use the chat box. There's a question from Perry about about Shanxindui.
Yeah.
Like, is there any writing scripts, I guess, found in Shanxindui?
I'm not so familiar with that. There's a catalog that Jay Shu from the San Francisco Art Museum, the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, did an excavation. I mean, an exhibition of that material at the Met, and you might want to read his catalog because he's one of the leading experts on that material, which they keep finding. Other related sites in the South, which are clearly part of the Bronze Age, but are related to the Shang material we've been talking about, but have a slightly different way of representing ideas. So I'm not sure. I think he'd be best to take a look at what he says.
Mhm.
Professor Juliana, I have a kind of comment and question. So
Sure.
I actually visited the museum at Anyang, saw the excavated tomb and the bronze vessels, the oracle bones, and just like this extraordinary creativity of the bronze vessels. They were not like they were kind of just unique to Shang Dynasty, right? And then later, they had this kind of superstition because they had the divinations, they had these human sacrifices, these cruel practices, but they also had this amazing creativity. But later on, Confucius ideology dominated China. Everything became very moral, very proper. but I guess the art went into a very different direction. So I wonder if you have any comment on that as to it, like, seems to me that like I would not normally associate with like Chinese art with that kind of like animal or just lively figure, and you just unrestricted sort of creativity. So as a researcher, I wonder how you look at that. That.
Well, I think it's hard to quantify what you're saying. I think that the creativity, I see Chinese art as having a history of creativity. I mean, of being able to transform, different materials and different imagery and, constantly in its history. And technologically extraordinary because that goes with it. Some of what they did with the bronzes wouldn't have been possible as much it would have been in materials which wouldn't have survived if they were not bronze. So on that point, but animals, as I think I was trying to indicate in the beginning of the other last week's lecture, though, that animals play a role in many early cultures. The natural world, the relationship between human and natural world was a powerful one, and many cultures see animals as they reassemble them. In other words, they take they're not as mythological as the ones you're seeing in the Chinese versions, but they take pieces of different animals and put them together to create an even more powerful animal, which then they identify with, that's the kind of power that they want. And in China, I think what's not really emphasized is the fact that north of China is what now is Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia, and even in China itself, there were lots of nomadic peoples, and the nomadic peoples always had animal imagery, and it did influence Chinese culture, particularly in the north, and in the south. You have different cultures, the Chu people and the Shu, different groups that were ethnically different, and so that you do have a mixture, and animals have always played a significant role in different ways in Chinese culture. And I don't think human sacrifice, unfortunately, is that uncommon in early cultures. And we do have basically, it's an aristocracy that is powerful, and it is it's centralized power, and the emperor and the rest, and you have all of these basically very, poor people laboring for the needs of of the ruling classes. And that remain as I said, it wanes. I mean, human sacrifice continues, but it does wane with the advent of Confucius, and it begins to become not acceptable in that way. And as I said, the only way I've ever seen it then again was in the Qin dynasty with Qin Shi Huangdi, who was considered a fairly horrific person in his own way. I mean, harsh and willing to kill. And he clearly they didn't want anybody to know where his tomb was, so they murdered all of the workmen. But they did that in Egypt too. After they built the pyramids, they killed the workers because they didn't want them to know, to spread any information about how you got in the pyramid, how you take the riches out of the pyramids, or disturb the burials. So it's not uncommon. I just think we sort of forget that. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but it's I think it's as I said, I think creativity is a significant characteristic of China's culture. It has been.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Professor. I have a question.
Sure.
On one of the slides, I noticed you showed us many how to say, the wine servers and
Right.
The food container. But that's very interesting. I didn't see any utensils like chopsticks or like I don't know if they have spoons by then. But I mean, I'm wondering.
They did have. I've seen ladles and spoon-like things. It's possible they had chopsticks, but they may not have been made. I don't know if they were made in any material that survived. Let's see, where did I see chopsticks? not till later were they preserved in Ma Wangdui's tomb, but that was 5th century. They found, food, actually found the food preserved, and it was in, Changsha, and they found the chopsticks, and they found the bowls of food in lacquer bowls, which were very much like food today in Changsha, apparently. So it was quite surprising, but I don't know of any utensils, but that's an interesting question. I've seen ladles, definitely ladles.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions? Well, I know it's already quite almost 15 minutes before 9 o'clock. I do see there's one more question. Let's see, coming from the chat box, again regarding Lady Hao, Fu Hao. Oh, I guess it's Milan to share some comments. As formidable as she was, well, to the point of Shang being patriarchal, she was one of the 64 consorts of Wuding. Well, I guess, yeah, it's like once you get the fascination and you can find more information about her on the internet. Yeah, I guess, I think everyone can see from the chat box. Before we close the session for the general public, I do want to mention on November 4th, we are having a field trip to the Ancient Studies, the Institute of Ancient Studies, where Professor Giuliano is also a researcher fellow. The link is in the chat box. So for those of you who are in New York, I would encourage you to join us. It's a free session. It's designed for K-12 educators. It's looking at a similar time, even though we're talking about hundreds or even more than 1,000 years apart. But it's looking at a different part of the world that we are looking at items discovered from European areas. From Neolithic to Bronze Age area, that is very much in the similar time zone, but in a different space compared to the subject of our series. And Professor Giuliano will lead the tour for that field trip. It's already on our website. It's not being promoted yet, so I would encourage you to sign up as soon as possible. And we will have a small reception afterwards. The New York University has generously offered their library nearby, so that way we can continue the discussion after the gallery tour. And also I want to remind everyone for the next session, it will be 2 weeks from today. Session 3, we will really look into. Today we look at Taotie and dragons, and in the next time period they are evolving into other forms. So we are looking forward to that as well. We only barely have like 10 minutes left for teachers, but I do want to. Everyone is welcome to stay. But I would ask my colleague Yongqiang to, let's see, first of all, if you could post the Google form for CTLE in the chat box for everyone, so that I want to make sure all the teachers would have the opportunity to get access to that form. We need the information in order to give certificate. And I would also encourage all of you. So now, for the general public audience, again, you're welcome to stay, but I would also, so the form is posted in the chat box now. And please feel free to get access to it. I would also ask my colleague Lin Laoshi if you could post the 5 questions that I proposed at the very beginning of this session. It's for the teachers as much as for everyone. Well, since we only have only 10 minutes left, I would just encourage anyone to share, and feel free to turn on your camera and your mic, and we would love to hear from you yourself. As well, we have fewer participants in this part. I know many teachers are going to teach tomorrow, so I would keep the session, well, we can end at 9 o'clock. So if you have any thoughts regarding the questions, and Lin Laoshi, if you could post the 5 questions again.
Sure.
Thank you. So if you have any thoughts, as it's in the chat box. Originally, we're thinking we could divide into breakout sessions, but then now we're only looking at 10 minutes. So if there's any thoughts that is inspired by those guiding questions, please, well, I would encourage you to share. And also I would encourage our teachers to turn on your camera. I can see Alice. Hi, Alice.
Hi.
Hi, Carrie. And I know there might be some new teachers joining today's session. So if you can just quickly, when you speak, well, you can quickly just to say your name, your school, and what subject and your grade that you're teaching. That would be great. Anyone want to start?
Yeah, I can speak first. Thank you, Professor. I really enjoyed seeing the kind of the animal figurines that are naturally in the different decorative arts. I never noticed that for especially the Shang Dynasty. And it immediately made me think of, I guess, like Mayan or Central South American animals. I just remember recently going to the Met, and you know how they have the
Right.
I guess the porcelain and like decorative arts around on the 2nd floor. They now have a section of like, I think Peruvian, and it's all animals as well. So it's interesting seeing that, because you were talking about how the ancient world has a lot of similarities, like sacrifices. And again, it made me think of like Mayan or kind of like Central American, South American decorative arts.
Yes, I was in Mexico to the archaeological museum there a number of years ago, and there's a temple, a small temple that you enter, and above the doorway there were figures that are intertwined. If I did not know I was in Mexico, I would have thought that I was in Eastern Zhou in China. It was so similar to things in that period that I was absolutely stunned.
Are there any explanation for that kind of similarities?
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of proposals that, you know, people came from the, you know, South, you know, from the, you know, Australia and the South Pacific, and, you know, made it over by crossing the Pacific to the, you know, to the west, but I don't think so. I just think that we forget, because of the culture we're in now, that animals were so much more important in their daily life, and that the whole issue about what animals, how they survived, what they could do, was far more important than we think about now. I mean, we think about pets, we think we go to the zoo, so we've put we put a big distance and barrier between us and the natural world in that sense. So we forget that early cultures didn't have that, and nor did they want that animals were critical to their survival in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so talking about taotie, I just actually following question someone asked before. It seems that they disappear after Shang and Zhou dynasty, or were they transformed? It seems
No,
that
it's transformed in that ancestor worship becomes manifested in different ways, which is what we're going to be looking at, the different rituals and the different, and also what was considered important, the hierarchy. But by the Han Dynasty, they don't totally disappear. They become the masks on handles. I mean, if you look at the doors of the palace museum, or the doors of the palace in Beijing, these big masks, which are actually animal masks, they're sort of a descendant of the taotie with the ring handles to open the doors. They're all over the place, so may not have the same magical belief and power that they were given in the Shang, but they didn't disappear totally.
I see. Yeah, very interesting. So there are just more comments coming from the chat box. I do have actually, I have sample activities based on my understanding of Professor Giuliano's presentation about bronzes. I was going to share for this session. Now we have like 5 minutes, but I do want to perhaps, just to use the last a few minutes to give everyone an idea. This is more of in Chinese sense of like 抛砖引玉. I throw out the bricks and I want the jade, from the audience here. I know you are all experienced teachers and you have your own ideas and how these content that Professor Giuliano has been we have learned from her lecture can be connected to your own class. So what I'm presenting here is just some idea that I form if I were to teach a class, especially a Chinese language class, what some of the information I may be incorporate into the activities. But the purpose is, I have 4 minutes left. We may have more next session to discuss, and I actually would invite my friend Miss Zhang Laoshi, Sherry Zhang Laoshi, to give more comments on how the activities can be connected to some of the criteria that the schools are looking at. For example, the teacher evaluation frameworks, the schools may pay attention to. So just quickly, let me share my screen. And I know, Professor Giuliano, you have many ideas, especially the animals and a lot of the icons can be really good teaching materials in the classroom. So this is a very short, a few slides. I was thinking of the informational text framework that was presented by Professor Nancy Motley. That's more looking at a framework that you go through talk, read, talk, write to introduce content-rich information while to English language learners, as well as it may be adapted to language learning. So I was just thinking of how this framework might be working for Chinese language learning and using the information that may be related to the bronzes. So my talk 1 may be just to give information like the pictures on the side that you have seen in Professor Giuliano's presentation, the bronzes that the students may or may not be familiar with. But while assuming these are fascinating images that would trigger their imagination and questions. And then there could be guiding questions, depending on your teaching goals, the subject areas, your students' age level. And I put both English and Chinese, because it could be for language learning, it could be for content learning, and it also could be in one of the dual language classes that, translanguaging can be a way of looking at learning both content and language. The thing is, well, perhaps well to keep in mind, you may want to limit the numbers. I gave like, well, 5 questions. You don't have to have all these questions, but well, you could have chosen maybe 1 or 2 or at most 3 guiding questions so that the discussions can be guided in a more focused way. And of course, your students' background, knowledge, and your objectives, well, are important here. And then in terms of giving out, because well, the beginning is to just throw out information for students to have some thinking and discussion started. And then these are actually taken from the MAT, their website. Just if we're talking about an authentic way of presenting information, I was just thinking, well, this could be one way of showing the materials while giving the information in both languages. Some of the key vocabularies for language learners, Chinese language learners, are listed in highlighted red here. And after students are given the information, well, there could be more questions asked, giving the teachers objectives. The last question, what it is made for, is meant to be more of an open-ended question, so that well, students might have some discussion and interaction with the teachers. And then there are more information that's given. Also, I tailored the information from the MAT that's giving more information about this particular item, and highlighting some of the keywords, like for example, taotie here. It's a new word. It's something that has a lot of cultural meanings, well, to decipher. But well, this information can be given to students, even in my imagination, well, it could be given even to students of Chinese language learning, because well, once they get the information and how to answer some of the questions in Chinese, well, it could be the next step. For example, here, then after some of the keywords, well, these are the pattern of sentence patterns or question patterns, well, even for Chinese language students, well, can be looking into. And then the last part, well, the writing part, again, going back to the very beginning, and then giving some very open-ended opportunities, well, for students to exercise, well, the output. Yeah, so these are some of it's very quickly, just.
I only want to put one footnote in. I think that with the discussion, I think the issue about creating, mythological animals or other kinds of creatures would be a very interesting path to pursue for students, because question would be, they chose to do this, but what would you choose to make something that you thought was special, powerful? How would you do it with animals? Would you make it unreal, mythological? Would you make it partly real? What would you choose? So I just think that that's a very rich area from little kids all the way up to the top. That's just one of the, at least even my graduate college students like to play with the animals. So in any event.
I strongly agree with Professor Giuliano, and I think that's where a range of the student could be from K to 12 and the college level, even adult, right? They can be very creative. They may have a clay shaping the animal, right? And then that displays their creativity. So first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Professor Giuliano for this informative presentation. Absolutely, it's been a pleasure, right, to be in your workshop and learn from you. And I believe that inspired me and all the participants to deep dive into the topic and integrate them into our curriculum and daily instruction. So with inspiration from this workshop, Liao Laoshi and her co-partner who made that lesson plan, Nancy Laoshi, They developed this sample plan, and of course, thank both of them for their open-mindedness and share this sample with all of us who stay behind as a benefit. I would call this bonus, right? While I am reviewing this lesson slide, I thought this lesson was scaffolding speaking and writing activity while hitting speaking writing standard. This is hit writing standard, which is Common Core standard, ERA standard, and using text visual to spark students' curiosity and thinking. Additionally, I think the sample lesson also hit Danielson component. I am a fan of Danielson. I say that's the way, component 3B, and using questioning and discussion technique. I share a one-pager, a Danielson one-pager to help participate. I think many people may know Danielson already, just in case some people who are not in New York City or our country, they may, maybe not familiar, but Danielson is the evaluation for teachers, their teaching, their instruction, their planning, their pedagogy and methodology level. I thought this lesson, for example, in the first talk, there were 4 guiding questions for students to think about what it's made of, what it's used for, and before releasing the reading text. Then student working group to discuss them. Although the discussion questions were not high cognitive challenge, I think it's a great start off for the beginner of the student. And those what question, the what question, will help lead to how and why question in the future for students when their Mandarin language proficiency is up to advanced level. And again, it could be great for a discussion with K-12 and grown up, right, in the college level in English. Moreover, the lesson was further scaffold to promote students' imagination, because it allows students to imagine and make connection from the text and their observation by asking students to define taotie and find a taotie on the theme. And students discuss what taotie look like to them and imagine what it's for. And again, that can imagination lead to creativity that Professor Julia commented earlier, right? Having hands-on activity. So I believe that lesson can be implemented in English, again, in social study, Mandarin bilingual class, and cultural classes, because they are obviously culturally relevant, meaningful, and purposeful. So all tasks, visual tasks, ritual, engage student in learning, so which is address Danielson component 3C, Danielson student, engage student in learning. At the end of this lesson, the instructor mindfully integrate writing into that lesson. So students will produce something in the class using the target language, a brief introduction of one object of their choice, and give their explanation of the topic. So I thought it's obvious that this task presents students with choice that address Danielson differentiation. This writing task is also a writing assessment that can assess student writing outcome, including their observation, content knowledge, language skill, vocabulary level, and so on, which again hit Danielson component 3D using assessment in instruction. It challenged students cognitively because they have to interpret what it's made for and give a reason. So I would suggest to asking students give a reason for it. Of course, the lesson intend to incorporate Danielson component 3B, 3C, 3D, and literacy hallmark when the instruction plan the lesson. Since the lesson slides are sample and not actual implementation yet, by this moment, by this time, they may already implement, but it's not being recorded and we are not witnessing it in the classroom. So we won't be able to evaluate whether it's developing lesson effective or highly effective or not. So the above are my comment. I took time to actually write enough. Thank you, Liao Laoshi, very much for this privilege for me to speak about my comment and inviting me to this awesome workshop and sharing my professional thoughts. I will be happy to continue to talk about questioning strategies with all of you next section. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zhang Laoshi. Yeah, well, I just posted the Danielson one-pager in the chat box. So if anyone want to look into it as a reference. Well, you can download from there. Yeah, I know we are all past time. Any questions, suggestions, any final thoughts? Please feel free to share. Otherwise, well, we will see everyone in the next session. And if you have any thoughts, because as Jiang Laoshi mentioned, this is a sample. It's not really put in classroom to test its effectiveness. And if you have any activity ideas, well, welcome to share with us, or you can just let us know you want to share next session. We can really we are really welcoming everyone's input and ideas. Yeah.